Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going deep, really deep, into a world that I think you'll find pretty fascinating and maybe even a bit unsettling.
Yeah, I'd say that's fair. We're diving into the world of spiritual groups and, well, cults. And that line between the two can get pretty blurry sometimes.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
It can be super tricky to figure out what's what. And we've got a ton of really interesting sources to help us unpack it all. We've got some academic studies on cults, firsthand accounts from people who have left these groups, and we'll even get into analyzing a few controversial figures.
It's like having all these different lenses to look through,
Yeah,
trying to get a clearer picture of what's really going on.
totally. I think this deep dive should really give our listeners the tools to better understand the dynamics of these groups, and hopefully, even more importantly, help them make more informed choices about their own spiritual paths.
Because let's face it, there are a lot of paths out there. And not all of them are, shall we say, well lit.
Exactly. And speaking of paths that might be a little shadowy, we've got to talk about Chris Butler. You familiar with him?
Yeah, of course. Chris Butler. He's the leader of the Science of Identity Foundation. It's also known as Chaitanya Mission, or SIF for short. Now, his story, well, it's a pretty winding one, to say the least.
Okay, I'll be honest. I'm drawing a blank here. Can you give me a little background? Like, who is this guy?
Totally. So Butler, he started out as a renunciate, or a sannyasi, in the Gaudiya Vaishnavism tradition of Hinduism. Think saffron robes, a life completely dedicated to spiritual practice. It's all about detaching from material things. Pretty intense, really.
Wow. Okay, so how did he go from that, like that whole renunciate thing, to leading a group that some people are calling a cult?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. See, he eventually transitioned away from that renunciate life. He ended up getting married, and, well, let's just say he's not exactly hurting for money these days. He's acquired significant wealth. And this transition from a renunciate to a married leader with a lot of wealth, it's a point of contention within Gaudiya Vaishnavism. By the way, just so everyone's on the same page, Gaudiya Vaishnavism is a branch of Hinduism that focuses on devotion to Krishna.
Oh, okay. It's pretty big in India, right? And I think it's becoming more popular in the West, too.
Absolutely. It's growing all over. And you can see why that shift that Butler made might raise some eyebrows within the tradition, right? Renunciation and riches, those two don't exactly go hand in hand.
Yeah, it seems kind of contradictory. Like, talk about a major life change.
Right. And it all gets back to this idea of parampara. Basically, it's the traditional lineage of spiritual authority in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. The idea is that you follow in the footsteps of your guru. You uphold the teachings that have been passed down for generations. So there are some pretty clear expectations there.
So it sounds like Butler maybe went a little off script.
To put it mildly, some people within the tradition, they flat out argue that his accumulation of wealth and, the way he lives, it just contradicts the principles of renunciation. And remember, those are central to the path he claims to represent.
Almost like he's saying one thing but doing another, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that disconnect, that's something we're going to explore a lot deeper as we get into what former members of SUF have to say.
Speaking of which, we have this document. It's called Exive Members, APS 00182.pdf, and it's full of firsthand accounts from people who've left the group. And wow, they do not hold back.
No, they really don't. I mean, these accounts are raw, they're powerful, there are some very serious allegations in there, both against Butler and against the group as a whole.
Okay, I have to ask, what kind of allegations are we talking about here?
Well, a whole range, really. But the main things that come up over and over are manipulation, financial pressure, and this intense social pressure to conform. The picture that emerges based on these accounts is that it wasn't exactly an environment where people felt comfortable questioning things or expressing dissent. Let's just put it that way.
Sounds pretty intense.
Mm.
Was there anything specific from these accounts that really stood out to you?
Well, one quote that really stuck with me is attributed to Butler himself. Apparently, he was talking about some disciples who weren't, let's say, as financially supportive as he would have liked, and he allegedly said, "Are those assholes still running that store in Lahaina? Why don't they give it to DTE, assholes, and they call themselves my disciples? Make all kinds of money while their kids skate and surf. Assholes, they should give it to me."
Wow. Okay, that's not exactly the kind of language you'd expect from a, you know, compassionate spiritual leader. It's actually kind of chilling when you think about it.
It is, right. I mean, it's such a stark contrast to the image of a renunciate who's dedicated to spiritual purity. And it raises some serious questions about the potential for abuse within these groups, even those that might seem to have really positive, benign teachings.
And, you hear about this tactic a lot with cults love bombing, right? Where they just shower new recruits with affection to create this instant sense of belonging. Is that something that comes up in these accounts at all?
Oh, absolutely. It comes up a lot. Former members talk about how that initial feeling of warmth and acceptance, it could vanish pretty quickly if you didn't, toe the line, or if, and maybe this is even more important, if your financial contributions weren't seen as sufficient. They even use terms like triangulation, meaning that communication was very controlled, and gaslighting, where you're basically made to doubt your own sanity. I mean, these are serious psychological tactics.
Okay, so this starting to sound a little, well, cult-like. But before we jump to any conclusions, I think we need to make sure we're all on the same page about what that word even means. Like what actually defines a cult.
Yeah, you're right. We definitely need a solid working definition here. And luckily, we have some fantastic academic resources to draw on.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of these titles: cults, faith, healing, and coercion, and thought reform, and the psychology of totalism. Those sound pretty authoritative.
They really are. And what's great about these texts is that they go beyond that, sensationalism that we often see around this topic. They're not trying to demonize any particular group. They're really aiming to give us a neutral, objective framework for analyzing these groups and how they operate.
So no pitchforks and torches then.
Not from us. Our goal is to empower our listeners with knowledge, not fear. And what these texts help us see is that cults often share certain patterns. There's certain characteristics that can be red flags.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of the telltale signs that we should be watching out for?
Well, first of all, you often see a very charismatic leader, someone who has this really powerful influence over the group's members. Think like a magnetic personality.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that could be problematic if that charisma is used for, shall we say, less than noble purposes.
Exactly. Then you've got these techniques of thought reform. Sometimes it's called brainwashing, but that term is a bit loaded. Essentially, it's about controlling how people think, what they believe.
Okay, yeah, that's starting to get a little creepy. What else should we be on the lookout for?
Isolation is a huge one. It's about cutting members off from outside influences, their families, their friends, even just sources of information that don't align with the group's ideology.
So they create their own little world, their own reality.
Precisely. And then, of course, there's the potential for exploitation. And we're talking financial, emotional, even sexual exploitation.
So our checklist here is charismatic leader, thought control, isolation, and exploitation. That's pretty sobering stuff.
It is, and it's important to remember that these are tendencies, not absolutes. Not every group with some of these characteristics is automatically a cult, but it's about recognizing that there's a potential for harm, right? You've got to be aware of the dynamics at play.
Yeah, it's like having a radar system,
Yeah,
knowing what to look out for.
exactly. And now that we've got this framework in place, let's see how it applies to Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation. And this is where our deep dive takes us down another really fascinating path, and potentially a disturbing one, too.
Okay, lay it on me. I'm definitely intrigued now.
So it turns out that there's another figure connected to Butler who just might blow your mind, and his name is Joseph Bismarck.
Joseph Bismarck. Okay, the name rings a bell, but I can't quite place it. Can you remind me who he is?
He's also known as Japa Das. Bismarck is a follower of Butler, and this is where things get even more complicated. Bismarck became a leader in this really controversial multi-level marketing company called QNet.
Multi-level marketing, those can be a bit, shady, right? Like those get-rich-quick schemes you see online.
That's putting it mildly. QNet has actually been accused of running pyramid schemes and even Ponzi schemes, where those early recruits profit by getting other people to join. And of course, it's the people at the bottom who usually end up losing big time.
So not exactly the most ethical business practices.
Not at all. And it gets worse. In fact, the sources we have, Joseph Bismarck, Japata 0000193.pdf, and Wikidocuments 00111.pdf, they detail some really serious accusations of financial fraud and exploitation against QNet in multiple countries. They'd had legal troubles all over the place.
Bro, on the one hand, we have these allegations of potential cult activity with Butler, and then on the other hand, potential financial impropriety with Bismarck. So is there a connection here? Or is this just a case of, like, two bad apples happening to be in the same orchard, so to speak?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But based on the information we've got, it seems like it might be more than just a coincidence. Because you know what? Bismarck, he actually credits his education to the Science of Identity University right on his Google Plus page.
Whoa. So there's a direct link back to Butler and his group.
There is, and that connection brings up a really disturbing question. Could Butler's teachings even if unintentionally, be influencing or even encouraging this kind of ethically questionable behavior.
Wow. Okay. So that connection between Butler, Bismarck, and CUNET is pretty mind-blowing. It's like this whole web of potential manipulation and, even exploitation.
Yeah, it's tangled, that's for sure. And I think it raises some really unsettling questions about, the potential dark side of spiritual seeking.
Totally. Like, how can teachings that are supposed to be all about love and enlightenment, how can those be twisted to justify these harmful actions? I don't get it.
Yeah, that's a really tough one, and it's something that, psychologists and cult experts have been trying to figure out for a long time. And there's actually a term for this. It's called the dark side of enlightenment. It basically describes how some spiritual leaders, and they're often the charismatic ones, how they can end up exploiting their followers'
Yeah.
vulnerabilities, and using it for their own gain.
It's almost like they're hijacking the whole language of spirituality to like manipulate people and control them.
Exactly. And it's so insidious because these teachings often target people who are already at a vulnerable point in their lives. They're looking for answers, for meaning, maybe even just a sense of belonging.
Yeah, and like we see in traumabusecults.pdf, a lot of these people have experienced some kind of trauma in their past, whether it's abuse, neglect, or just some really difficult life circumstances. They're just looking for like a lifeline, something to make them feel safe and secure.
Right. And that's what makes it so dangerous. I mean, these groups can seem like the perfect solution to all this pain, right? They offer love, they offer acceptance, this sense of purpose, but that often comes at a very steep price. You end up losing your individuality, your autonomy, your ability to think critically.
Yeah, it's like you're trading your freedom for this false sense of security, this feeling of belonging that may not even be real.
It's a really tough trade-off, and I think it can be especially seductive if you're feeling lost or alone. The group becomes your whole world. The leader becomes your savior, like the only one who truly understands you.
But that kind of dependence on a leader or a group, it makes you incredibly vulnerable to exploitation, right?
Absolutely. And that's why it's so crucial to understand the psychology behind all of this. It's not about blaming the victims. It's about recognizing the power dynamics that make people susceptible to this kind of manipulation.
Yeah, it's almost like a predator targeting the weakest members of a herd.
It's a harsh analogy, but it's true. And it's not always about overt abuse or, outright coercion. It can be so much more subtle. It operates on a psychological level.
Yeah, it's funny. This whole conversation is making me think back to something we talked about earlier. It's that idea that cult leaders often try to project this image of perfection, like they've achieved some kind of enlightenment. But is that ever really the case? Are these leaders actually enlightened beings, or are they just really good at playing the part?
That's such a good question. And honestly, based on what I've read, I'd say the answer is a resounding no. I mean, there's this great article, I think it's called Cults and Deteriorated Spiritual Systems.pdf, and it talks about this phenomenon where spiritual teachings become, well, fossilized is the word they use.
Fossilized. What do you mean by that?
Well, imagine this. The original intent of the teachings, the real heart of them, it gets lost over time. And then the focus shifts away from genuine spiritual growth, real inner transformation. And it becomes all about dogma and rituals and obedience.
So it becomes less about, connecting with something greater than yourself and more about just following the rules, not rocking the boat.
Exactly. And the leader becomes this ultimate authority on truth. They claim this special knowledge, the special power, and anyone who questions them is labeled a heretic, a traitor, whatever.
And that brings us right back to that isolation tactic we were talking about, right?
Yeah.
If you're completely cut off from other perspectives, you're more likely to just accept whatever the leader says, no matter how messed up it might be.
It's classic. Control the information, you control the narrative, you control the people.
Chilling. So how do we even begin to, like, break free from that kind of mental conditioning? How do we learn to think critically? How do we develop that ability to know what's authentic and what's potentially harmful?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And it's something we're going to dig into a lot more in the next part of our deep dive.
Mm.
But I think one of the most important things to remember for now is that we all have this inner compass, this intuition. It can guide us.
You mean like that gut feeling, that little voice that says, something's not right here, even if you can't explain exactly why?
Exactly. Don't ever dismiss those feelings. They're often trying to tell you something really important.
It's like that old saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
100%. And that applies to spiritual teachings as much as it applies to anything else.
It's interesting. We've talked a lot about the psychology of these groups, the spiritual aspects, But there's another piece of the puzzle we haven't really touched on yet, and that's money.
Ah, yes. The financial element. We can't ignore that, especially with all these allegations swirling around QNet.
It's like they say, follow the money. Right? That often leads you to the truth of the matter.
Right. And with groups like these, it's not always about, blatant fraud or pyramid schemes. It's about the more subtle ways that money can be used to control and manipulate people. Like, some groups demand huge donations, or they might pressure members to work for free or for very low wages.
Which sounds a lot like exploitation to me, especially if the leader is living this lavish lifestyle while their followers are barely making ends meet.
It often is. And, it's important to keep in mind that authentic spiritual teachers, the ones who are genuinely seeking truth, they don't usually make a big deal about material wealth. Their teachings are about inner transformation, not getting rich.
So if we see a spiritual leader driving a fancy car, living in a mansion, but their followers are struggling, that's a big red flag.
Huge, massive red flag. And speaking of red flags, I think it's time we shift gears a bit and talk about some more specific signs to look for. Signs that a group or leader might be heading down a dangerous path.
Okay, hit me with it. Give me the cheat sheet. What should our listeners be watching out for?
All right, first and foremost, you want to pay attention to how the leader handles dissent. Do they welcome questions? Do they encourage critical thinking? Or do they immediately shut down anyone who disagrees with them, using anger, intimidation, or even by shunning them?
That's a big one. I mean, a healthy spiritual community, it should encourage open dialogue, not blind obedience.
Absolutely. And along those same lines, watch out for any excessive secrecy or this kind of us versus them mentality. Those groups that isolate themselves from the outside world and demonize anyone who doesn't think like them, those are often the breeding grounds for extremism and, potentially even abuse.
So it's more about building a sense of inclusivity and respect rather than creating division and fear.
Yeah, exactly. Another red flag is if a group uses shame or guilt to control members. Genuine spiritual teachings, they should empower you, not make you feel inadequate or unworthy.
Okay, so if you're constantly being told you're not good enough or that you need to work harder to earn the leader's approval, that's a sign that something might be off.
Right. It's about recognizing the difference between healthy self-reflection and unhealthy manipulation. And honestly, that can be tricky, especially if you're in a vulnerable state.
It's a lot to take in. I mean, it can feel really overwhelming.
I know, it can be, but it's important. And remember, we're not saying that all spiritual groups are bad or dangerous. There are lots of wonderful, supportive communities out there that can really help you grow and connect with yourself and others.
So how do we find those good ones?
Yeah.
How do we know which paths are authentic and which ones might lead us astray?
That's where discernment comes in. And it's not like there's this perfect checklist or a set of rules you can follow. It's about cultivating your own inner wisdom, learning to trust yourself, to feel what's true and what's not.
So it's like a muscle we have to strengthen, that ability to discern.
Exactly. And just like any muscle, it takes practice. Start by questioning everything. Don't be afraid to ask those tough questions, research different perspectives, and trust your instincts.
So it's okay to be skeptical. It's okay to not just blindly accept everything we're told, right?
Being skeptical is healthy. It means you're thinking for yourself. And honestly, that's really what this whole deep dive is about. It's about helping you become a more conscious, more discerning seeker on your own spiritual path.
I like that. Well said. I think it's a great place to pause for now.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot in this part. We talked about the psychology of vulnerability, the dangers of those fossilized teachings, even the role of money in all of this.
Yeah, but we're not done yet. There's still more to come. In the final part of our deep dive, we're going to get into some specific techniques that you can use to evaluate spiritual groups and leaders. We'll give you some concrete tools to help you navigate this whole landscape with more confidence and clarity.
And we'll even share some inspiring examples of what those authentic spiritual paths can look like, the ones that can actually guide you on your journey.
So until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and keep asking those tough questions.
Welcome back, everyone. Whew, I don't know about you, but all this talk about cults and, it's spiritual manipulation, it's pretty intense. It's a lot to process.
Yeah, no, it's definitely heavy stuff. But, we don't want to scare anyone off from spiritual seeking altogether. That's not the point here. It's really about giving you the tools to be a more discerning seeker, a more informed seeker. It's kind of like, You wouldn't just buy a car without doing any research, right?
Oh, absolutely not. I'd be reading reviews, comparing
Mm.
prices,
Yeah.
maybe even take it for a test drive before I committed to anything.
Exactly. Choosing a spiritual path, I mean, it deserves at least as much careful consideration.
Okay, so let's get practical here. What are some, like, real-world tips? What can our listeners actually use to evaluate a spiritual group or leader? Give me the action plan.
All right, well, remember those red flags we talked about in the last part. Those is a good starting point.
Yeah.
Let's say you're thinking about joining a new group, or maybe you're already in one and you're starting to have some doubts. What can you do?
Yeah, I'm ready for the cheat sheet. What's
Yeah.
the game plan here?
First, take a step back. Just observe. Look at how the group actually operates. Is there transparency? Can you get access to financial records? Are decisions made democratically, or is it all top down, with the leader calling all the shots?
So it's about looking at the structure, how it actually functions, not just what they say.
Right, exactly. A healthy group should have clear ethical guidelines for their teachings, yeah, but also for how they operate, for everything.
That makes sense. What else?
Okay, this one's important. Pay really close attention to the teachings themselves. Do they actually resonate with your core values? Do they empower you to think for yourself? Or do you feel like you need the leader's approval all the time? Like you need the group to tell you what to think?
Yeah, that's a good point. Some groups can be really dogmatic, right? Like, our way is the only way kind of thing.
And that's a huge red flag. I mean, true spirituality should be about expanding your consciousness, not limiting it. You should be encouraged to question, to explore, to find your own unique path.
It's about freedom, not control.
Yes, 100%. Okay, and another thing. This one's big. Check out the leader's behavior. Are they walking the talk? I mean, are they actually living in alignment with the values they preach about? Are they humble? Are they compassionate? Do they genuinely seem to care about their followers? Or do you get a whiff of ego? A bit of narcissism, maybe? Are they power hungry?
So it's about looking at their actions, not just their words.
Right, you got it. Actions speak louder than words. And sometimes those actions can reveal a whole other story, a different picture than what they're presenting on stage or in their teachings.
Okay, so I'm hearing a theme here. Critical thinking, questioning, looking beyond the surface.
You got it. And honestly, maybe the most important thing is this. Trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't ignore those red flags, even if other people are telling you you're wrong or that you're being paranoid.
It's like that little voice inside that whispers, something's not quite right here, even if you can't quite figure out what it is.
Exactly. That's your intuition, your inner guidance system. And it's way more accurate than we often give it credit for.
Okay, but what if you're already in a group and you're starting to have those feelings of doubt, those feelings like something's not right? It can be really hard to speak up, to challenge the status quo, especially if you're worried about being, ostracized or labeled a troublemaker.
Oh, I know. Leaving a group can be incredibly difficult, especially if you've put a lot of yourself into it.
Yeah.
You've invested time, energy, maybe you've even made some really close friends there. But, ultimately, your well-being comes first, always. So if you need to distance yourself for whatever reason, do it. You don't have to explain yourself to anyone.
Sometimes self-preservation means walking away. But hey,
Exactly. And, there are resources out there, support systems that can help you transition out safely, help you rebuild your life.
speaking of resources, are there any specific organizations or websites you'd recommend to our listeners who might be going through this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There are some great ones out there. The Cult Awareness Network is a good one. Also, the International Cultic Studies Association, they have a ton of valuable information and support for individuals, families, anyone affected by cults or other, harmful groups.
Perfect. I'll make sure to include those links in our show notes. Before we wrap up, I do think it's important to say that this whole topic, it's really nuanced. It's not always black and white, good versus evil.
You're so right. I mean, there are groups out there that might have some cult-like tendencies, but they're not necessarily dangerous. And there are people who are drawn to these groups for totally valid reasons, right? Maybe they're looking for community, or they want to grow spiritually, or they just need a sense of belonging. All those things are understandable.
So it's not about labeling every group with a big good or bad stamp, right? It's about using our critical thinking skills, using our discernment to evaluate each situation. You got to look at it case by case.
Exactly. And that's really what we've tried to do in this whole deep dive, right? Give you a framework, some key concepts, and then some practical tools for navigating this really complicated landscape. Now it's up to you to take what resonates and apply it to your own life. It's got to make sense for your own unique situation.
Yeah, it's like we've given you a map and a compass. Now you can go out there and chart your own course, make your own informed choices.
And remember, spiritual seeking, it's a journey. It's not about reaching some destination. It's about exploring, learning, growing. And sometimes, it's even about stumbling a bit along the way. That's part of the process.
Yeah. And sometimes it's even about walking away from something that's no longer serving you. And that can be hard. It can even be painful, but sometimes it's necessary.
Very well said. And you know what? I think this brings us to our final question, maybe the most important one of all. We've talked a lot about the negative aspects of these groups, the red flags, the potential for harm, all that. But what about the positive side? What should we be looking for in a truly authentic spiritual path? One that can actually nourish our souls, the kind that can guide us toward real growth, real transformation.
That is a great question. I love it. Let's end on a positive note here. Let's focus on the light, not just the shadows.
So, listener, I want you to think about this as you continue on your journey. Ask yourself, does this path, does it cultivate love? Does it cultivate compassion and wisdom? Does it encourage me to question, to explore, to become the best version of myself? Does it feel expansive? Does it feel liberating? Or does it feel constricting? Does it feel controlling? Really sit with those questions.
Those are powerful
Yeah.
questions. It's all about tuning into that inner compass,
Mhm.
right? Listening to our hearts, listening to our minds, and just feeling what truly resonates deep down in our soul.
And ultimately, I think it really is up to each individual to find their own way, their own unique path to truth and meaning. No one else can do that for you.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into this world of spiritual groups and cults.
Wow, yeah, it's been a fascinating journey, to say the least. I hope it's been helpful, thought-provoking, maybe even a little challenging at times.
We covered a lot, from defining what a cult even is to understanding the psychology of how they manipulate people. And then we got into those warning signs and gave you some practical tools to help you discern, what's what.
But remember, the big takeaways here are those core principles: critical thinking, self-awareness, and trusting your gut. Those are your most powerful allies on this journey.
And hey, if you ever find yourself questioning a group or a leader, or if you need support leaving a situation that feels harmful, please don't hesitate to reach out for help. There are resources available. You are not alone.
We really hope this deep dive has given you more confidence, more clarity, and a healthy dose of discernment as you navigate the spiritual landscape. It's a wild world out there.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe out there.